When it comes to BoxCutter, my favorite area for customizing my behaviors is the behavior panel that's located under the sprocket in the top bar. You can also locate it by pressing D, and it's here where you can go in and begin customizing the behaviors of BoxCutter. You're also able to access it through the end panel, of course. We try to make everything as accessible as possible. But anytime that you're using BoxCutter and things are just going awry, or you need a particular behavior to assist you, that's where the behavior panel comes in. So these next segments, I'll be talking about all the options that are inside the behavior panel and how to utilize them best for your experiences with BoxCutter. Most of these I've already covered in some capacity, but I just wanted to have a section where I went over everything that's as far as your experience that you can maximize with the behavior panel with BoxCutter and how to get the most out of it for you. I know these videos can seem a little daunting and there's a lot to cover, but I can only guarantee and hope that by the end of this, by having you share a mutual understanding of BoxCutter and where we're trying to go with it, that you're able to get the most out of this as a product. So now let's go into depth about some of these behaviors in the behavior panel. One of the first things listed in the behavior panel is the destructive, non-destructive toggle. We also have it listed in here at the top bar because when we first were putting out BoxCutter for 2.8, it became visually confusing to people as far as if we were keeping things live or applying them. Of course, the difference between non-destructive and destructive for us is we draw a cutter, we see that this cutter's left behind, we can bring it back if we need, versus working in destructive. When we perform a cut, the cut is completely removed. In fact, if we wanted to remove this cutter altogether, we could just apply it and get rid of that. But you see that every cut that I perform, it'll show it initially and create the collection just for the beginning of the operation, but at the end it will just remove everything associated with it because there are no cutters left to associate with that operation. So it's just a different way to work. If you're wanting to just cut once and be done, that's one way to work. However, I personally enjoy working non-destructively and then having the option to say shift to live and move the shape on the fly to make adjustments to it, which is something you're not afforded with destructive mode. In fact, I'm pretty sure with destructive at this point, we have it where if you do shift to live while in this mode, you are able to still move it around even if you're in destructive, but you can always, of course, apply it. But keep in mind that general cuts will just destructively be removed and the collection will also be removed. There's nothing else holding it together. So that's the first option located at the top of the behavior panel. So the next option in the behavior panel is the apply button, which is also located here and has been promoted to what we call BC Smart Apply. And what we mean by that is you can draw a cut and let's say we shift to live and we kept this shape. If we were to click on apply at the top bar with the cutter selected, it will remove that particular cutter. So let's draw a shape, but we'll press L in order to keep all the shapes that we draw live at this point so we can talk about them in depth. And all these shapes are still here, they're still live, and they're still adjustable because I pressed L to convert them into live selections and toggle off the adjacent options to keep these shapes. But if I keep an eye on the outliner, that whenever I click on apply shape, it just removes that shape one by one. However, let's say I want to just apply all the cutters completely. I can also click on the apply button and it will apply it as well as remove the cutters that were associated with it. So it's just another way to handle apply from the BoxCutter side. Of course, whenever it comes to apply, there's a myriad of options also within BoxCutter as well as C#, also having the capabilities of removing cutters, but that's just on the HardOps side. Whenever it comes to BoxCutter, we just want to be known that you could even do things like start BoxCutter in edit mode, draw a shape. This is a edit mode cut. You see it obviously affecting geometry. We could shift to live, which now puts us in the live state of this shape. We'll control R and add a loop cut. And then we can, go into face mode and grab this face in the back and make a modification. And let's say we wanted to apply this and go back to our main shape. We click on the BC Smart Apply and it actually applies it and puts us right back where we started with the edit mode of this shape, where we can continue going in here and performing destructive cutting inside of edit mode. So when it comes to our behavioral sprocket, when you drop it down and you expand on behavior, you're hit with a lot of options. And the first one you'll be curious in will be sort modifiers. And the best way to show this in action is to basically explain that, sort is one of those things that you either turn it off or you turn it on, depending on your needs. But while you're box cutting, we will try to keep your modifiers in a certain order to maintain sanity and keep things versatile as far as workflow is concerned. So, utilizing a bit of HardOps, we'll press Q and bevel this, roll a couple of segments in. And so if sort was not present whatsoever and just wasn't a thing, we would perform a cut, with the cube, of course, and it would just place this cut on top, and this is the expected result. However, thanks to the power of sort in this day and age, we do something called sort bevel, where if you perform a cut, it will place the boolean before the bevel. And this can come in handy because let's say we went under operations and we performed a step, we now have two bevels, and then if we perform a cut, it actually places this new boolean before the second bevel, allowing us to deal with this on its own level. So it's kind of a system we've created that allows users to take advantage of their modifier orders to get desired results. So that in a nutshell is the reason that bevel exists. And so whenever we look at this arrow at the end, we're referring to something called last sort, which means that we will only sort the last instance of these modifiers. So I could just spend forever talking about each and every option and why we have them sorted, but to just talk about some of the most important ones, at least at this time, we'll also talk about UV project, which is connected with HardOps. We'll press Q and go under add modifier, and by shift clicking we can add a UV project empty and also a modifier to the object along with the grid material. And so we see this object is basically UV'd for us. And if we were to perform box cuts, we see that thanks to the power of UV project sort, we're able to cut this and actually have the UV project modifier be kept at the right order in the stack. In the event that it was in the wrong place, this is what the result would look like. So if this was going on, users would definitely complain to us about it. And notice that the next cut just automatically corrected it. That's the power of sort in action. It's just one of those things that we've developed over time and look forward to finally creating a version that doesn't really have any UI to it, but just does all the desired behavior just on the fly. But sort is just one of those things that you'll be glad it's there for you whenever it's there, but if you're not aware of it being there, it can definitely be a bit of an annoyance. So another way to also show sort in action is we'll select everything and delete it, and we'll just place a cube, and we'll go to regular mode. As far as shading, we'll put a remesh on the cube, and I'll press Alt V and turn on wireframe so that way we can see what's going on. And we're just going to turn off sort and perform a cut. And of course, this is the result that you would expect to happen whenever you place a Boolean modifier on top of a remesh. And while this is a very small edge case that no one should really care about, it is one that we took care of with hops, where if you have sort remesh enabled, you are able to cut and it will basically place the booleans in advance, so that way you can perform a remesh on your mesh, kind of allowing you to get this all quad cutting workflow going. So it's just a really interesting way to work with our tools if you're trying to get experimental with things, but definitely one of those things that is there for you whenever you need it. So I just wanted to go over just a couple of cases of why sort is one of the first options you see whenever you join HardOps or whenever you use BoxCutter, and how you can use it to the best of your abilities. It also shows up on the HardOps side, where under sort you can choose which modifiers are being sorted and which ones aren't. Another instance in which sorting will play to our advantage is, let's take this plane, or let's delete a face off of this vert off of this cube, turning this into this, and we'll press Q and add a solidify. And if we go ahead and perform a cut, we see that this cut is being placed after the solidify. In the event that we did not want that to happen, you could also turn on sort solidify, which will actually place them first, resulting in a much different experience whenever you're using this. So it looks like I'm cutting through it, but actually I'm just cutting through the plane itself, and then the solidify is happening to it. So even in times where you possibly don't want a particular behavior, we do also have it available for users to be able to experiment with. I'll move that shape out of the way for now, and we'll just keep on cutting. Just notice that the moment that I extrude it, this cut's already a thing. There is no midpoint, there's no halfway through this cut. But if we were to take our solidify and place it as the first modifier and go under here and turn it off sort solidify, we're able to cut and have varying levels of depth with this. So there are times where you may want to look at the sort and decide if it's right for you in the type of model that you're dealing with. But there are times when it could be working against you depending on the type of workflow that you're utilizing. There are videos, of course, going into more in depth about sort, so definitely check into it if you have any more questions about it. As you deduced by now at this point of videos, whenever you're using BoxCutter, we also are using modifiers. So of course there's an option to choose what modifiers are kept after an operation. So the two that are turned off by default is keep lattice and keep screw. So to show these in action and why they would be left, let's keep an eye on our outliner here, and we'll just draw a box and just shift to live, and we see that we have our cutter, but we also have our lattice. And normally the lattice is instantly removed the moment that an operation is complete, but you do also have an option to keep it around for shenanigans like you see here. Something that's rarely done but still can be done, and that's because our boxes are drawn using lattices. While it's rather simple for a box and results in something similar to a wedge, if we were to switch over to a circle and we began drawing a circle and we shifted to live, we see that things just didn't work out with this because of the modifiers in place. And more than likely this is because keep screw isn't going to work alongside of keep lattice. So let's try that again, and this time we were able to keep it. However, I want to draw it and hold shift to keep it live. And the reason this works is because we can't have a live screw being deformed by a live lattice because it's going to have issues with the order of modifiers. So while it seems like a bug, it's definitely working the way it's supposed to. And so with us being able to keep our lattice, we're able to just kind of scale this in and create a really interesting cutter, unlike what we were dealing with before. So sometimes there are benefits to keeping certain cutters or keeping your modifiers live, but we'll just turn these two off for sanity's sake. Keeping mirror is something that's on for sanity reasons. By keeping mirror, if you were to say draw a shape and press 1 to mirror it and shift it to live, we still have the dynamic ability of the mirror. If you wanted to apply it and move both of these at the same time, you would just have keep mirror unchecked. Weld is the same situation, but one of curiosity I do want to talk about is keep bevel. Keep bevel sometimes comes in handy, where if you turn keep bevel off, let's say that we were using a box and we drew a box, but we press B to bevel this, and we just shifted it to live, we now have this box cut out, right? So I'm just going to scale it around a little bit, and I could go in edit mode, grab this, use something like HardOps curve extract. Maybe I want to apply to scale first. Then we can actually go in and actually adjust the curve and just quickly add a curve to this region. And sometimes with these sort of things, I like to follow up where I'll do a cut, but I'll press A or J in order to turn it into a join, and then extrude it out and just quickly make a nice little latch. So there's all sorts of uses that can come out of keep modifiers, but for the most part, we have screw and lattice off by default and the rest of these on by default. And so if you are curious in what they can offer, just think about if you want your modifiers applied after you use them on a cutter. So another example would be if I were to draw a box and press V in order to use an array, I can shift it to live, and I can press Q and go inside of HardOps and still adjust this array on the fly without having to deal with the rigmarole of applying it and dealing with it again. So we could theoretically turn off keep modifiers for array, and then we use an array, and whenever we shift this to live, we can see that everything has been applied. And the benefit of this would be for me to say grab every other edge, bevel it, and create a unique pattern here that I couldn't have ordinarily created, having it dynamic and live with array. So whenever it comes to active only, one of my favorite examples is we'll just take this face and press Ctrl I and select the inverse and delete that, and we'll just select this face again and just search for poke. We'll poke this face and press Ctrl B to bevel. And we'll just roll the wheel one time, but we'll press P in order to set the profile to 1. And we'll just extrude this up. And we could just select a boundary and extrude this down and press F to fill that. And basically we create a big manifold X. So if I were using Box, I would want to cut in this area, and we see that using Box isn't going to work. Of course, there's newer tools that can make this a lot easier, but let's say we didn't have line box to make our lives easier. Let's just move up this plane that I Shift A inserted. We'll use HardOps and convert it into a wire. And let's also subdivide it a little bit so it looks like a wireframe. And we press RZ45, and we've rotated this shape 45 degrees. So this shape is kind of like our alignment grid that we can use just to help us out on our adventure today. So if I were to go under my behavior panel and toggle on active only, this means that if I select this object and then shift select my main object, that whenever I draw a box, it's going to actually be oriented to the surface that I have selected as my secondary selection. So with this, now I can actually get in here and perform the cuts that I need to at the angle that I desire. And so, you know, back in the day, this would be one of the ways that I would normally work. I would just have two objects selected and then just perform my cuts using active only, knowing that because active only is on, it won't allow my cuts to actually penetrate the secondary object that's being utilized as a guide. But in this day and age, if I were to want to deal with this, I would simply just toggle line box and just draw a line, orient it first to where I want it, and then just extrude it. Maybe press T to solidify it, give it a little bit of thickness. We can turn off grid for snap constraining. And we're just putting our cuts exactly where we want at the exact angles that we want. In fact, I could scroll this up to wedge, start working this side if I want to really start getting crazy with this. So as you can see, the alignment tools have definitely gotten a lot better as far as how we're able to pre-align our boxes in advance and even create wedges, as you see here, rendering active only something that still exists for specific uses but isn't as needed as it used to be. So with this shape, just to finish up this demo and just make it make sense, if I were to want to mirror this, I would use HardOps to mirror. I would press Alt-X and then mirror this to the other side and then mirror it to the other side of that. And let's say that I actually wanted the mirror to be mirrored on this way, mirrored on this particular view, then I want to mirror it across. So I can press Alt-X, press V to switch to view using HardOps mirror, and we'll just mirror this to the other side. And then we could just press Alt-X again to bring up a new mirror, and then we'll press A for new mirror, press X, and then A, and we just mirror that on the X and on the other side, and here we are getting a perfect mirror to the other side. And then the best part, of course, is that I can just get in here and keep working my shape and it will just mirror to the other side, except in this case I already know that it added 3 mirrors that were not needed. Maybe I just needed 2 mirrors. Let's try to find the right axis for this. There we go. And so now I can actually cut this and it will mirror 4 ways all the way across. So active only is there for you in cases when you don't have line box to assist you and you want to just override the orientation natively. But in the event that you're wanting to do it as you see me doing here, these options are still available to you. Another one of my favorite ways to show off the purposes of active only, first we'll enable it, is with the circle demo. So we're already in circle and we'll use this point as a jump off. And so now I've cut inside of this and I'm not able to jump off this point anymore because it's been cut out. Well, if I were to press Q, use HardOps, and use the mod bull scroll toggle to bring back this shape, we can actually just select both of them, and now I have this circle as a jump off point, allowing me to bring this shape out and perform the cut that I need to along the rim. So it's just another way to use active only creatively to put cuts in areas that normally would be unavailable due to them being hollowed out. The behavior line box needs no introduction. If you're already familiar with Box, you can just click and drag and just draw boxes to your heart's content to do cuts. However, there's also a behavior called line box that you can toggle here that will allow you to start off drawing a line that will allow you to orient your rotation first and then convert into a line. In this case, I'm using wedge, so I'll hold Alt and just roll the wheel back one in order to convert this to line box. But you can see that line box allows for your rotation to be aligned first and then the cut to be done second, allowing you to get those angular cuts exactly where you need them on the fly. However, it's located in the behavior area just for users to be able to toggle it off and on the fly. However, keep in mind that this is the mod behavior of Box itself, so it can also be toggled here, in addition to holding Alt and scrolling through all the different cutting types to be able to jump to line box on the fly whenever it's so desired. One of the things you might notice about me is that I'm always using Box Cutter in orthographic mode, and that's because that's where it performs the best and also gives the most predictable results. In fact, we'll switch this over to Box, and we're already in line box. Sometimes I forget that line box is a thing, but we see that inside of orthographic mode, we're able to cut things exactly as desired. If we jump into perspective, we can still perform cuts on the surface willy-nilly without any sort of issue. However, if we try to perform a viewport cut, things get a little bit more complicated where things may work out, but sometimes the cut may not be exactly where you're seeing it in your viewport. And this sort of irregularity can sometimes be a little bit frustrating, especially if you're just trying to really get your cut on. So for that reason, we have an option called Auto Ortho, similar to Auto Perspective. This can also be enabled inside of your Shift V, where if you begin drawing your cut, it will jump you into orthographic mode, allowing you to get all of your cuts and your subsequent cuts to work out successfully. So sometimes users need a helping hand with getting their orthographic set up, especially if you're working on a laptop and you're not wanting to deal with the toggle up here in the top right. You can just turn on Auto Ortho, get in, and just cut to your heart's content. So let's say you're using Box Cutter and you're taking it to Box City. So you're starting off with HardOps and you're placing a bevel on it, and then you're Control-Shift clicking bevel to add a second bevel, but then pressing X to set it to a half bevel, and then you're just performing your cuts on it like you would normally be doing. And then you add another level of bevel on it and you're still performing cuts, and you begin slicing pieces off, but you still want to continue working on the shape and getting a nice form. Of course, adding a weighted normal to stop any sort of shading issues that come up. Just playing with the new buttery speed of this latest release of Box Cutter that we put so much work into trying to optimize. Just making slices ever so casually, occasionally, just performing cuts on your model. And then, comes the time when you want to begin dealing with things, right? So right now we're just cutting this model willy-nilly, not a care in the world. However, if I were to take this slice and tap into edit mode, we see this the full piece. If I were to take this in local mode and take this to a modifier scroll, we see the entire journey of this cube up to the point that it becomes an intersection, and then its journey truly begins here. So sometimes this can be a little bit excessive, depending on the complexity of your model. If you're slicing things repeatedly, your slices are inheriting the history of your mother piece. So for that reason, Apply Slices is available, where you can just continue working as normal, but in the event that you need to perform a slice, you can still do that. I want to probably get a little bit more in there. But if we take this piece and we tap into edit mode, we see that the slice has actually been applied. And this will lessen the weight on your computer and the strain that comes with all the modifiers, especially when it comes to things like applying it and smart applying it down the road. Sometimes smart apply will remove the cutters associated with other objects that have cutters associated with it as well, because there is no system yet to duplicate cutters and make them their own in such situations. So for that reason, Apply Slices is there for you so that you can slice an object off, and that object will have its own new unique shape without any sort of history to weigh it down, allowing you to work as fast as possible. The next behavior of discussion will be talking about recut. Recut's real special because instead of performing a slice, you're able to cut from a previous point in history. At this point, you see me performing a red box cut, just cutting out areas, and then now I'm performing additional red box cuts to just kind of cut my own way. So if I wanted to, I could draw a box and press X in order to turn it into a slice. And when it comes to showcasing recut, the best way to show it is by first pressing H to turn it to a wire showing, and then press Alt X in order to perform a recut. So instead of getting a slice, which is what we had before, we're able to basically recall a recut. So here it is as a slice, and then a recut is us recalling the original mesh and slicing that in. So now we have this new piece that's cut out and isolated and able to fit inside the enclosure that we cut out very nicely. And then all it is just a matter of us going in and just making a few modifications in order to get it to fit inside the bounds that we have drawn for it. Of course, we'll use a little bit of HardOps, maybe put some honeycomb in here, scale that out, scale it upwards, and there we are, just cutting out a pattern with recut and then using a little hops tool to put a pattern inside of it. Sometimes whenever you're working, it's beneficial to see the geometry that you're affecting. So to show this in action, I'll press Q and we'll add a small bevel to this mesh. And if we begin drawing with box cutter, we see the result of our cut on the mesh, but we don't see the result of the wireframe. If we press Z, you can actually toggle that to be on. However, if you want this to be on every time, underneath your behaviors, you can turn on show wire, and every time you perform a cut, you'll actually see the wire result happening to your mesh, allowing you to basically make more informed decisions. So here I am performing a circle, and we see that the circle, even though I have it live, is solving the way that you see it, moving it closer to an edge, allows it to result in no solve because the edge itself is solving it. But let's say I really want the circle here, I can see the results of it already in this location. And the thing about box cutter is that whenever you, even if you don't have show wire on, if you're using something like knife, in this case, whenever you begin to draw, you will actually see the wire, so that way you can also be informed as to what you're about to perform with your knife. So show wire is just one of those ways to just see your wireframe on the fly whenever you're performing a draw operation. So sometimes it can be assistive, sometimes it can stay in your way. We prefer to draw with you just looking at the actual result. However, sometimes pressing Z during draw can be assistive towards seeing the wireframe and letting you know what's going on. So sometimes scale can affect certain things and certain behaviors. One easy way to show scale affecting things in an undesirable way is to just put a bevel on a mesh and then just scale it in object mode. So now you see the corners of this have become warped because I've scaled it on the X-axis, and this could be a little bit of an annoyance. So if we go into our behaviors, we see that apply scale is actually on by default, but we'll go ahead and just turn that off and just perform a box cut. So we perform a box cut, press space bar, and we see that everything works out. However, the bevel is just a little bit skewed, so we'll need to scale that down. Also notice that the moment that I go into bevel to adjust it, it automatically makes it fine. However, sometimes scaling issues can get in your way and make things a little bit problematic, as you can see there. So for that reason, we have apply scale inside of BoxCutter for users to be able to use on the fly in order to prevent these sort of issues from happening. And for that reason, it's actually on by default. So I'll just perform a cut. You see the scale's already corrected and set to 1, allowing me to get the most desirable result whenever I'm performing a cut, even on a shape just like this. Show shape is another toggle that whenever you have it on, it will show the shape whenever the operation is completed. It also is useful in conjunction with auto hide, meaning that by having auto hide off, it will allow your shape to remain. The hotkey for just setting this up is L. So if you're drawing a shape and you have these settings set the way that I just shown, you'll see that the shapes are being left behind, allowing me to select them and move them around. However, I can also draw a shape, and during draw press L to turn live off, and now the shapes will actually be hidden whenever the next draw happens. So this is a kind of a cleaner way to work, and it's kind of the trademark way that we've always used BoxCutter. However, in the event that you want to see your shape, you could just press L and you'll see that your edges will turn green, allowing you to know that they are live. So anytime you see the green edges, it's just an indication that someone is drawing in live mode. But you can always just turn that off by just pressing L, which will turn off the adjacent options inside of the behavior panel. So that's basically auto hide and show shape in a nutshell, because that's how our set to live system works. So one of the first things we try to assist users with dealing with BoxCutter is their auto smoothing, and for that reason we have auto smooth enabled by default. And what this means is that we'll just select this object, press Q, and just put a sphere cast on it in order to just quickly turn it into a sphere. And you see that the shading is rather faceted. If I were to press D and switch over to Ngon, notice that from the moment I draw my first point, this shape has been auto smooth and set up for us to perform this boolean and get a relatively smooth auto shaded result. Instead of having users deal with keys and auto smooth panels, we just wanted to assist users with dealing with this automatically. However, in the event that you wanted to perform a faceted cut, that is able to be done as well by turning off auto smooth. So now you see that I'm able to just perform this cut and there will be no smoothing being performed except for the areas that are being, I guess, cut in newly. But that is, in a nutshell, the purpose of auto smooth inside of BoxCutter. Whenever it comes to BoxCutter, sometimes you want your cutters to be associated with your object and move around with it. As you see me doing here, I'm able to perform a cut and then select the object and press G and just move the object around. I can rotate it, and this is thanks to the behavior of parent shape. If we were to toggle parent shape off, when I perform this cut, we see that this cut did not go with the object, and so it's staying in place while I'm moving the object around. And so sometimes this isn't a desirable behavior. And for that reason, we have parent shape enabled as a default behavior inside of BoxCutter. In the event that you have your object and you have a bunch of cutters and you want to parent it after the fact, that's where HardOps comes in, with you being able to press Q, go under operations, and use something like late parent, which will retroactively parent the cutters to the shape, allowing you the freedom to move it around and scale it without any sort of issue. So in order to show this example, the easiest way would be to get a UV grid material on this object, and the easiest way to do that is to actually use HardOps. So we'll go under Add Modifier, and we're just going to shift click this to add a UV grid. However, I'm going to use box select and select the empties and just delete them. So that way the UV project modifier is invalid. We can just remove that. And so we now have this object that just has a grid material. If we were to look under our behavior panel, we see that cutter UV is disabled. And what this means is that if I were to perform a cut, we get just this hollowed out cutter area, meaning that there's no UV on the cutter to be transplanted onto the target. And while this seems like a rare occurrence that you may never use, there are times where you may want a cutter UV to be present, allowing you to cut into a mesh and just generate a UV on the fly inside of the region that you're cutting. Of course, this has been replaced by our UV project workflow. However, for classic reasons, this still exists inside of BoxCutter in the event that you're wanting to cut and also generate UVs on your cutters at the same time as you're cutting them into your mesh. For a quick crash course on extraction, if you were to draw a series of cuts in an area and decide that you wanted to keep them, you could draw a box around them or a shape and press Y in order to extract, and then when you extract, that becomes your custom cutter. And then by holding shift, you can draw it in proportionally. As you see me doing here, I'm able to just draw this shape in, repeat it, and rotate it around, and my origin is still set to something weird. But this is basically the goal of being able to use custom cutter. In fact, we see that we don't have auto smooth on, so our cutters came in looking weird, and cutter UVs is on, and we actually don't need that at this time. But here we are basically using custom cutter via extraction to extract this area and repeat it repeatedly. So whenever it comes to extraction, there's something called surface extract, which allows you to extract basically anything. And then there's regular extract, which will only extract booleans. In this case, I was only able to extract the booleans of this area. And to prove this, we will go into edit mode and just put a couple of levels of subdivision in this. And I'm just going to press Q, and we will just convert this to a circle and just extrude this down. You know, we can change this to individual origins, and we're just cutting in some circles, and these circles are modeled by us. Meanwhile, this area is created by booleans. If we were to press D and switch over to box and we perform an extraction, more than likely this extraction is going to only reflect the booleans themselves. In fact, it did a very poor job of extracting the surrounding geo, but we can see that it did try. And this is where extraction in this classic form ends and surface extract begins. So if we have this toggled on, which should be on by default in BoxCutter, and we press D and switch over to box, we'll just draw our shape, press Y. We now see that there's a perfect extraction able to be replicated of that particular area, and we could just hold shift, drag this dot around, press R, rotate it, get it just right, drag this dot exactly to where we need, press spacebar to apply, and that is extract versus surface extract in a nutshell. Whenever you're using BoxCutter, you can click and drag to create a shape, and then on the second drag you can deal with your extrusion. However, if you were to not give it a extrusion depth and just click and apply, it will perform what's called a laser cut, where it will cut all the way through the mesh. So anytime you cut and you don't actually give it any depth, you're able to cut completely through the mesh. And this is what we refer to as laser cut. And you can see in the fade the amount of size that the shape has been given. And this is something called AccuCut, which was a recent enhancement that was made with BoxCutter to make it more accurate. If we were to turn off AccuCut laser cut, we can see what the difference is in the laser cut. Whenever we perform a cut, we can see that it shoots all the way through the mesh and goes out a little bit further in space than maybe we would like. And you may be thinking, hey, that's really not that big of a deal. But if we were to switch over to Hops tool and hold control in order to use dots, sometimes the dots can be a little bit far out in space in order to recall a shape, and this can be undesirable whenever it comes to dealing and managing booleans on the fly. And for that reason, laser cut AccuCut exists to help you get a more accurate cut every time. So previously we talked about how laser cut has AccuCut to allow it to cut more accurately to a mesh. However, with the added benefit of AccuCut being able to limit itself to the distance of a mesh, we also have the additional benefit of being able to go under the behavior panel under shape and choose how far we want that depth to be with laser cut. So if we were to perform a laser cut now, we see that it only goes down to 0.2, and this can come in handy for whenever you need to cut things of a certain depth every time utilizing the laser cut system. However, it also must be known that if you cut in an area that's similar to the previous area, you'll create something called a hotline, which can possibly cause Boolean issues. So if we move this over to the side, we can see that this is performing better. However, because of something going on with AccuCut and the way that we're getting things really accurate, there's probably one of these Booleans that's just not working out for us. So let's try to actually get in and solve it. And we see that the answer isn't very far away. We can bring back this cutter, and just by moving it over slightly, we can bring back this mesh. So sometimes Booleans can be a little bit fickle whenever it comes to hotlining. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. Just like you see me running into this geometric issue here, this is something that is very common that can happen whenever you run into Booleans that are just sitting properly on the same coplanar edges. And sometimes they can be a little bit tricky to resolve. However, guidance edges are always recommended in order to ensure that your Booleans get the correct amount of guidance given by the human touch. So for this example, we'll create a quick shape. So I'll hold control, use the circle as a jump off point, we'll bring a circle down, and then use this new area as a jump off point, press J to turn it into a join, pause it, press Control D to bring up the helper, we'll give it 8 segments, press B in order to bevel this, and we'll click to apply, and then we'll hold control and use this as a jump off point and pause that, jump the segments back up to 32, and here we've created a quick shape. So let's say that we wanted to perform a box cut around this, and then we press Y to turn it into an extraction. If we were to draw this shape and then let laser cut have its way, we would get a result similar to this. However, that's because in the previous example I just tried to use laser cut depth. So if you want to have your objects cut via laser cut to a particular depth and not all the way through like you're about to see here, then this is where you would go in and modify this particular parameter. So let's say we actually wanted this to go in at 0.3, maybe 0.3, not 3 in general. We now are able to draw this shape and just laser cut it to that absolute depth every time. So this is a quick way to just kind of gain an additional amount of control whenever it comes to laser cut. However, whenever you're cutting things to a constant depth, you must be mindful of depth and how it can work against you in certain scenarios. But I just wanted to show how you could use laser cut depth to your advantage to quickly get shapes to have the same exact amount of depth whenever it's cutting inwards. Inside the behavior panel, there's a shape area, and there's also a series of options here pertaining to the bevel and the default settings you get whenever you use it. So we're currently inside of box, and I'm going to set my start operation to utilize bevel. And if we begin drawing our shape, we see that we're using just one segment on this box, and this is because of our settings that are specified here. If we wanted to have a quad bevel as well, we could enable that here, as well as enable a straight corner flow, which will allow for a better flow in corners whenever it comes to utilizing box. So to activate rounded contour bevel, you can press Q inside of the bevel operation. So here I am pressing Q in order to enable it. And then if I wanted to toggle this behavior, we could also go under the behavior panel where we can jump to bevel, and these options are also available for us to toggle here. And you can see the results of what happens whenever they're not enabled in action, while we're also modifying the amount of segments because we've jumped into the modal whenever we activated this. So whenever it comes to shape, there's a series of settings here allowing you to quickly adjust your bevel on the fly. However, this purple dot that exists inside of pause mode is here to allow you to drag it inward to convert from a bevel to a chamfer just on the fly, depending on your needs whenever you're using the quad bevel inside of BoxCutter. Since the dawn of Custom Cutter, we've endeavored to have users able to scroll among their custom cutters. And for that reason, under shape, there's a toggle called Cycle All Cutters that's enabled by default. And what this does is whenever it's enabled, it allows you to scroll through any cutter that's in the cutter's collection instead of just limiting it to things that are not named cube. So to show this in action, I'm just going to draw a box, but we'll shift it to live. So we've drawn one box cut and we have this cutter live. And so I'm going to Shift D, duplicate over to the side. And with this duplicate, I'm just going to Control R, add a loop cut, slide this piece back. That's a new cutter. We'll Shift D, move this over to the side. We'll also clean the mesh because it's nice to have a clean mesh. And we will go into face mode and extrude this down and bevel that as well, and that's a new cutter. And we'll bring that over and look at it from top view, bring up BoxCutter, maybe press Control X to see through it. And even though our shapes disappeared due to us using BoxCutter, we're going to put an EM macro on this one in order to extrude it out very quickly. And just like that, we've created 3 different cutters from the initial cutter that we shifted to live. And keep in mind that this cutter is still live. So if I were to draw another cutter, we could basically press C to scroll through the custom cutters that we've created. And this can result in some rather interesting ways to model. As you see, I'm able to just press C in order to scroll through these. You can also hold Alt and scroll through them. And it's just as easy to specifically mark a cutter as a cutter for draw to use exclusively, but it's also nice to just grub through cutters that you have in your cutter collection. Currently, I am gutsy enough to feel like I can cover the entirety of the input subpanel of the behavior panel in one go. So drag threshold is related to the amount of drag that's related in a click before a box is drawn. This is something that normally we never have to adjust, but it is there in case that you have a super hyper ultra wide 8K 16K display, or you're having some sort of diagnostics issues in which you're pointed directly at click threshold. There's really no reason for me to demonstrate it because it's just perfect the way it is. The next option we'll talk about is release lock. Release lock was already covered in previous content, but with a traditional box cut, we draw a box, and then when we release left mouse click, we're able to jump into extrude, and then when we click, we've confirmed it. Instead of having that as our general maneuver of being, we can turn on release lock, which means that when we click and release, it actually just drops the shape in this 2D state, which is cool because you can alt scroll and find the right shape. If you had alternative shapes in your scene, you could grab the dots and adjust it. You could hold shift and actually translate the shape. You could grab this bevel dot and bring it in and turn it into a chamfer, or bring it in again and turn it into a bevel depending on what you fancy, as well as grab this dot in the center and choose to extrude it out. So it's a more graduated way of working through your box cutting process. So just like release lock helps you process your maneuver whenever you're drawing, laser cut lock helps you process by pausing it when you've performed a laser cut. So to show this in action, we'll enable it under input, and whenever I click and drag, you know, everything's the same except when I release, it will jump to the laser cut depth, which I actually have set in my preferences under shape because I forgot to set this back to 0 earlier. So if we were to take it back to the top and then click it, we see that now the laser cut depth has jumped to the size of the object. But instead of just going to this and applying, we're actually in this intermediate state where we could still grab the shape and move it around. So it's a really handy way to work if you're the type of person who likes to draw a shape and then contemplate it and make adjustments and maybe slide it around and just choose the absolute right position before you truly commit to it. Of course, alternatively, you could just shift it to live and tweak it to your heart's content. But continuing on, going through our settings up here, the next one is quick execute. Quick execute is a no holds barred type of cut where basically you cut and it just performs the operation, no questions, that's it. You just cut and it's done. It's the fastest way to cut possible. It's reminiscent of our 2.79 days, and it's one of my favorite ways to get in here. In fact, all these tools have been customized to work together, so they also play together very nicely. In fact, you can use release lock with laser cut at the same time, or laser cut lock with release lock to get some really interesting combinations. So here I am turning on release lock, laser cut lock, and quick execute, and the result might be interesting. This is something that we call God Ray, where basically you're able to draw a shape and still be able to adjust to draw, but it's able to jump to the laser cut position, which results in a really interesting type of workflow. I've yet to find a use for it in my personal work, but every time I play with it, it's just a nice way to just zone out and just play with some laser cuts, just watching them cut all the way to the end, just seeing a bunch of systems play together nicely without bugs is just something I can sit back and personally admire. So we'll turn these off for now, and the next one we'll talk about is shift to active. Whenever it comes to drawing a box, let's say I wanted to edit this after the fact. If I hold shift, I can keep it live, and select to active will make it where whenever you shift to live, it actually selects the shape. Alternatively, turning this off will allow you to shift it to live, but will not make it the active selection, which can just be a little bit weird. But it really isn't a big deal. It's just an interesting way to work if you want to maintain your correct selection. So never really mess with select to or shift to active. Now, when it comes to enable top bar, there are some people out there, small contingency, that hate the top bar. I know, weird stuff, but it's a thing. So if we turn off enable top bar and we right click show header to get rid of the header, and we just exit box cutter by just switching to a different active tool, now whenever we press Alt W, we're able to go in and use box cutter without that pesky top bar getting in our way. However, if you are the type of person who fancies or even misses that top bar, we can of course go through our DPI. One of the many reasons we have multiple avenues for approach. We can go back in here and turn on enable top bar. And if we just jump to select tool and press Alt W, bingo, we're back with our top bar where we know and love things. So the next one I want to talk about is allow selection, which allow selection is part of our system of supporting alternative key maps. So there's really no reason for me to demonstrate this unless I want to erase my setup real quick. When it comes to RMP cancel NGON, this one is for the NGON users out there. We'll make a new file just to demonstrate it. And if I jump over to NGON through the DPI, whenever you're working in NGON, you could right mouse click to get rid of points, or you can just right mouse click and just get NGON completely off the screen and out of your life. So in the event that you are not wanting to work like that, it is a toggle where you're able to work and say right click repeatedly in order to backspace points in case you're the type of person who just needs to go back a couple of paces in order to analyze what's going on with their work. So just letting you know that that option is there for you. So these are things that I rarely go into, but they're there for the particular users who work with very unique input sets. So we'll just leave that off. Preserve alt is part of those who use the preserve alt in the preferences. So if you're one of the users who emulates numpad through the input settings of emulate 3-button mouse, we will take care of your alt for you. And if you are a right mouse click user, we have extended on right mouse click support in this version. Alt center, shift uniform refer to our drawing patterns. So we'll switch over to box for this. So I'm drawing a box and it's using corner draw. If I hold alt, I'm now drawing from the corner. And if I hold shift, I'm now drawing uniform. And if I hold alt plus shift, I'm drawing uniform plus equally from my center point. So, I mean, if you don't want to hold all these keys, you can just also press period and you will be able to switch to center draw as you see here, or press period and switch back to just regular corner draw on the fly. So any events you really need to modify your draw, you are able to do that whenever you have to. But just letting you know that these types of behaviors, if you're not into them, you are able to turn off. We used to have it where whenever you were in circle, scrolling the wheel would adjust the amount of segments, and I found it to be quite terrible to the point that it had to be disabled. New to this version, if you hold shift and roll the wheel, you're able to lower the segments and raise them during the modal, which is, during the draw, anytime the logo is colored, of course, and just change the circle on the fly. And this should actually make it a lot more versatile. View pie, last but not least, refers to the accent grave or tilde key that's in top left corner of your keyboard, that when you press it shows these controls. By having this on, it means that we can draw the shape, press tilde, change this to top. Sorry for people who don't have a tilde. This is a Blender thing. I'm just saying we support it. I didn't say that we made this, all right? And so we are able to basically use the tilde key to jump around, which actually comes in very handy for laptops. I'm not usually the type of person to enjoy Blender pie menus, but as I got to using it and pressing it over and over, more than likely accidentally, I've become acquainted with this thing and have almost found a friend in it. So just letting you know that we do support that. And that, all in all, is a brief synopsis of the input panel of BoxCutter. Last but not least of BoxCutter is the display subpanel. When it comes to BoxCutter, from top to bottom, I care about every single aspect, and as Warden, I intend to make sure that this tool is at its best at all times, if it's possible, under my guard. So whenever it comes to BoxCutter, there are those out there who dislike dots. So if you tab into live, you can see the dots that you're able to use to adjust the shape. But if you want to isolate yourself from dots and have a pure experience, you can press Alt-D, and that will allow you to toggle dots as you see here. However, there's also a toggle for this, which is what the Alt-D hotkey does. So Alt-D is not a hotkey that's talked about a lot, but in the event that you want to just get rid of dots, you can toggle them like so. The next thing we want to talk about is simple top bar. So top bar can be either expansive or simple, and that option is here for you right here. When it comes to grid mode, notice that right now I'm in cut. So that means that my grid is actually going to be the color of the operation. At the time that we implemented this, we thought it was a pretty good idea. And I actually think it's interesting to use for new users to at least let them know what operation they're about to perform. For example, if I deselect this, notice that my grid is gray because there's no reason for me to do the cut operation with nothing selected, because theoretically, what is there to cut, So for that reason, you can also bypass this and turn this off if you want, and just have the grid mode color be just a neutral color no matter what. So here it is on the floor just being a make color. Here it is on the mesh just being kind of a neutral color instead of being the color of the operation. So when it comes to BoxCutter, we are fully intent on users being able to customize their experience. I'll turn grid mode color back on just because I'm a big fan of it. So when it comes to wires only, you can have wires only as a mode. I'll turn it off, and this is what your normal shape will look like whenever you draw it with BoxCutter. However, during draw, you can of course press H to toggle into a wireframe. And during this mode, you can also choose to have thin or thick wires. So notice that inside of thick wire, there's a parameter that I'm able to raise on the fly in order to just adjust what is happening with this particular shader. But for me personally, I usually keep it as a thin wire. And then last but not least is our fade parameter. So I'm going to exit wire for this one, and fade in is at 0 because speed is our #1 concern. However, just for fun, we're going to set this to 600, and we're going to actually set this one to 1200. And what this means is that whenever we draw, there's going to be a draw fade in period for a shape, and then there's going to be a fade out period. So I'm pleased to announce that fade has returned to BoxCutter717. It was taken out in order for us to try to speed up the add-on itself and get to the bottom of what was possibly making things slower. But now that things have been addressed, I'm pleased to announce that fade has returned to BoxCutter717. So I hope that users are getting in there and at least setting a long exit fade just to have some fun with BoxCutter. Maybe not too long of a fade because it can have issues with alpha and overlap, and things just get weirder whenever you get into Blender 2.91 at this time. But I do think setting it to something like 120, which is basically my refresh rate on my monitor, and we could set the end to maybe 60, and we get this really nice smooth box cutter experience that just fades in and out, just ever so subtle, just allowing you to work at the speed of thought, but also letting you experience fade the way it's supposed to be, fast and fluid without standing in your way, just an additional way to just let you see what's going on. Sometimes when it comes to fade, it's easy to look at and think of it as just a luxury item. However, fade also has benefits. For example, whenever you perform a laser cut, the after fade really gives you a clue as to what has been performed. For example, we perform a cut, we can see it. Let's say that we had it at 0. If we had it at 0, it would just leave immediately and we would never know. In fact, we said at 0, it actually stays longer than I think it was designed to stay. So that's something that I'll be checking into post this recording, but that's a little odd. And there we go. At something like 1, we see that the shape just leaves immediately. Meanwhile, this previous shape may never leave. And that's just an interesting observation, but I'll definitely be having that checked into prior to this final release. But it is kind of interesting seeing that this shape has the hang time of the gods. So you know what, we're just going to continue working around it because this is the final section of the video. But whenever it comes to box cutter, as once you know that fade is something that we care about a lot, we did have quite a few users point out its absence and request when it was going to return or if it was a permanent option. And of course, when it comes to us, there's no reason that we would ever remove anything and let it permanently stay gone. You know, I gathered the Dragon Balls to bring it back before I would let that happen. So there's always something waiting around the corner, especially for things whenever they're missing. One such example is the recent return of UV draw. So if I were to Control A and visual geometry to mesh, and we could just press. Let's try press Control Z, and that didn't work. Sometimes Control Z will just make a shader go away, but I wanted to show that in this version of HardOps, UV unwrap has returned, bringing back UV display, which is something that we haven't seen in a very long time, but we never want to let a classic go. And the same thing goes for fade. Just like this shape, we'll never let it go.